Hi, I'm Professor Green, and we'll be talking about Chapter 7 here, Part 2 of 2. We're going to continue now here with the government regulation of business. And so, what they talk about when they mean regulation, this is the act of government to establish rules of conduct for citizens and organizations. It's also a primary way of accomplishing public policy. So, the governments act at multiple levels, right? Federal, state, and local. And so they bring in these regulations to help monitor and regulate those the organizations that work within those governments. So let's move on to the next slide and get into the meat of this all. So what are the reasons for regulation? The first one could be market failure, where the marketplace fails to adjust prices for the true costs of a firm's behavior. Right, so this is where companies might have little incentive to spend money on product safety, environmental or food or something like this, where they just, as we see the example here with the EU standards for food contamination, this is where companies are often, they welcome this because then the competitors also have to bear some of the costs, right? So this is where the in the EU, they said that there are maximum levels for lead and for mercury in particular foods. And Nestle, for example, based in Switzerland, really agreed with this regulation because they were already making their pet product with these regulations, but now their pet product was a little bit more expensive. So once the regulation came in, all the other pet products had to meet that level, and then they could compete much more easily in the dog food market. So there was market failure where the pet food companies weren't doing this on their own until the regulations happened. The next one could be a negative externality. This is where the manufacture or distribution of a product gives rise to an unplanned or unintended cost, so, also known as spillover costs. This is where that example of the safety guidelines in the coal mines, right, shows up. So that the unions came in and said, "Oh my goodness, there's a lack of safety when we come into these coal mines. That black lung disease was showing up again and again, particularly in the UK." And so the government came in and said, "Okay, we need to regulate this. We need to make sure that the people who are working in those mines are protected." Right? This is coming back to our ethical frameworks about justice and fairness and utilitarianism, right? Because now this is a rule for all of society. So that was kind of an unintended or unplanned cost that happened in the coal mining business. The next one is natural monopolies. This is without competition, firms could raise prices as much as they want. And this happens more and more these days, right? As companies get larger and to have mergers and acquisitions with other companies, which we'll go into further in this chapter. But here, the example that they give is electric utility services that, these are natural monopolies. So this is where electrical company will put up poles and lines and things, but there's really only a particular amount of space available to put up these poles and lines. So you can't have competitors necessarily with these utilities. And so the government has to come in and say, okay, I know there's only one way to get electricity through this one pole or, this handful of poles in this particular line. So we want to make sure that the people are not being gouged with prices. And then the last one here on this slide is ethical arguments, consequences, fairness issues. As I briefly spoke about already, there's a little bit of overlap in these ideas, but this is where that UK Modern Slavery Act came into play, that the nail salons, which again we'll study again in this course, right, that the employees in the nail salons weren't being treated fairly. They had very long hours, very low pay. And so the government came in and said, okay, we need to have some sort of regulation on making sure that these people are treated fairly in the workplace. Great. And again, this is that utilitarian approach where the regulations come in and we create safe working conditions for everyone. But again, based on the idea of fairness and justice. Let's hop into the next slide. Here we're talking about types of regulation, and just like in public policy, we have two types of two different types, this time in being in regulation, and the types are the same, economic and social. So let's first talk about economic regulation. This is the first bullet point says here, this is the aim to modify the normal operation of the free market and the forces of supply and demand. This is the oldest form of regulation. This includes controlling prices or wages, allocating public resources, establishing service territories, setting the number of participants, and rationing resources. So again, this happens because of potential monopolies or consequences of actions of the organizations, like we saw in the coal mines, for example. And one of the important points that they don't put on this slide, but that's important from the chapter, is the book starts to talk a little bit about Dodd-Frank here. So this is where they set up some compliance laws. We briefly spoke about it in class that Obama set this up, and he said that the United States needs to come in and have more regulation when it came to financial laws, corporate governance, also about where the US is investing and buying products from. Dodd-Frank came up initially when we started to speak about the Myanmar and the Amber case, where the people were being oppressed in northern Myanmar by the military government. And so Dodd-Frank would say that potentially that US customers cannot buy amber out of Myanmar. And I don't think that's happened yet, but it's coming close to happening. And but the Dodd-Frank has definitely been applicable to products coming out of Africa, where things like diamonds are being mined and they're not being, the people are not being looked after who are doing the actual work for those products. Let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. Here we talk about antitrust. This is a special kind of economic regulation, and it has its own slide because it is such a big issue. Here it says antitrust laws prohibit unfair, anti-competitive practices by businesses. The really great example that they speak about it in the book is the AT&T Time Warner merger of 2018. And so this is where it was really kind of a hot topic that these two technology companies wanted to become one, and then it was blocked, right? Because the federal government said it would really stop competition. They would have too much of a monopoly. They would be able to gouge the prices. Potentially, they wouldn't give customers as much any options for these types of technology products. And so it took months for the federal government to review, like, truly, is this going to be a monopoly? Is this an antitrust situation? And they said yes, that AT&T and Time Warner were not allowed to merge. So why does that happen? That's because the predatory pricing is the price of selling below cost to drive rivals out of business. So, right, if you have a company that drops its costs so low that they get all the business, then they can potentially drive their competitors out of business. So the regulations then stop organizations from doing that. If the government sees a company doing that, then they have the right to go in and stop the company from selling the product. And here also they talk about the two main antitrust enforcement agencies. This is the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. So really great names to know as you enter the workplace, because they will come up time and time again. So now let's talk about the types of regulation that are considered social regulation as opposed to economic. Here, social regulations are aimed at such important social goals as protecting consumers and the environment and providing workers with safe and healthy working conditions. So now this is going back to those coal miners, right? These regulations, which apply to all businesses: equal employment opportunity, protection of pension benefits, health care for all citizens, pollution control, safety, and health concerns. The next slide gives us figure 7.1 from the book. And it's a really cool graph, I think, because it really highlights which industries or which areas these major organizations sit. So some of the big ones that are familiar to you probably, hopefully, are the IRS, Internal Revenue System. You can see that this sits under the taxation umbrella. Another one that is probably familiar to you or will be is the SEC. This is Securities and Exchange Commission, right? Because I worked in New York and I worked on Wall Street. Everybody in New York is very familiar with the SEC because we want to make sure that when we're doing trading, that we follow the guidelines of the SEC. And I actually had a friend from undergrad from Villanova who worked directly for the SEC for a few years before he went back to law school. And it was just a really good opportunity to get into to banking law, I guess is what you'd call it, corporate law. And then another one that I think should be or could be familiar to you is OSHA. This is the Occupation Safety and Health Administration. And so this goes back to the safety in the workplace, building codes, etc. So I take some time just to become familiar with a lot of these names and then make those connections, right? Where do they all sit? Which other organizations are they related to? Now let's talk about the effects of regulation, right? What happens after the government comes in and does some regulating, the costs and the benefits, right? Here, the government hopes that the benefits arising from regulation outweigh the costs, not necessarily always. But this cost to benefit analysis helps the public understand what is at stake and what new regulation is sought. So before people get so excited about regulating something, they also have to look at what the costs are associated with going into that. So at the end of the day, someone has to pay for these benefits that are being created, right? So in addition to paying for the actual program, whether it be having low-income housing or having the actual program designed to keep the miners safe in the coal mines, it takes people to administer, monitor, and enforce these regulations, right? And so if you ever worked on a construction site, right, you continuously have inspectors coming out to enforce these regulations. So who's paying for those inspectors every day in every construction site around the world, right? Those are our tax dollars. But the government says that it's important to have those inspectors because we need these building codes. We need these regulations to make sure that our homes and our office buildings are safe. So this graph is interesting because it talks about the spending on US regulatory activities, both social and economic. As we spoke about, those are the main two. Social, again, being environmental health issues, occupational safety, and consumer protection. And as the book was saying here, in the year 2000, we saw a really nice, right? We saw regulations can be nice, but they can also be not that nice, as we've been discussing now. So, but for social regulations, we saw an increase here in the early 2000s, and now it's kind of leveled off. So it's just interesting to see kind of where we are as a society today, that regulations, economic and social, are consistently increasing, social at a much faster rate. But because economic regulations have been implemented quite regularly for a long time, it's the social ones that are just becoming much more popular in recent years. And we'll see what the future holds, right? That the book also talks about the Democrats versus the Republicans. That if a Republican is in office, as we'll talk about in the next slide, right, like Reagan, he saw a lot of what's called deregulation. So continuous regulatory reform is, the first one is deregulation, the removal or scaling down of regulatory activities of the government. And the deregulation in the United States starting in 2017, when Trump came into power, but also when Reagan was in power in the 80s, there was a lot of deregulation. And now when we have Biden in, as you can see, that there's a lot more re-regulation, so the expansion of government regulation. And also in the 2000s in the security and financial services industry, when we had that collapse in 2008, they said the collapse was due because there wasn't enough regulatory oversight as to what the banks were doing, and people were handing out mortgages to people that couldn't necessarily pay them back. So that was another time when we had to go through a time of re-regulation. And let's talk about, for our last slide here, regulation in a global context. This is where the government establishes rules to protect the interests of their citizens, international regulatory agreements and cooperation. And how I think about this is that a particular country, right, they don't want to accept products into their country that they think will injure their citizens or be potential unfair competition for their companies within that country. So the second and third bullet point here say that sometimes nations negotiate agreements directly with one another, and that sometimes they do so under the auspices of the United Nations or regional alliances. And so the book gives a handful of different examples, but I think the most current one that the book doesn't answer or talk about is the China situation, right? So that during the Trump administration, we saw that he wanted to heavily regulate the products that came into the US from China, because he just felt that they were taking over and we were just getting too many products from China, and then the US products weren't able to compete with the Chinese products. So we didn't have any tariffs or any regulations on those products coming into the United States. On the other hand, China was heavily taxing the US products that are coming into their country. So, Nick Trump, I guess he wanted to negotiate, but China was not interested in negotiating because they were really winning for sure before Trump came into power. And the debate continues right now that Trump is no longer in power. I have to say we don't hear about it very much, but I think that what I've heard last is that the tariffs are slowly dropping because Biden wants to have a strong relationship with China. I guess at the end of the day, he doesn't want to annoy them with the high tariffs and regulations that Trump imposed on them. So again, Trump was trying to protect the citizens and the businesses within the United States because he felt that they couldn't compete with the Chinese products. And also at the same time, right, there are a lot of Chinese products that came in that were unsafe, right? And so we definitely want to protect against those too. All right, great. That ends chapter 7. This is part 2 of 2. I look forward to discussing the Facebook case and talking about regulation in class.